and welcome to Spirit of Film Conversations. I'm your host, Randall Libero. Movies are changing the way we think, live, and dream. So each week we showcase today's top independent and visionary filmmakers whose movies evoke what I call the spirit of film, which is a metaphor for the movie's magical power to transform our lives. And this week we're going to be talking about exactly what that transformational power is. In my personal research into the art of story and the mythology of movies, I came across a marvelous website called Cinema Discourse, and you can find it online at cinemadiscourse.com. And with us today is one of the creators and editors of that website, John David Ebert. John David Ebert is an independent cultural critic whose essays, reviews, and interviews have appeared in periodicals such as Lapis, Alexandria, Utne Reader, and the Antioch Review. He is the author of Celluloid Heroes and Mechanical Dragons, Film as a Mythology of Electronic Society, and Twilight of the Clockwork God, Conversations on Science and Spirituality at the End of an Age. John was a former editor at the Joseph Campbell Foundation. John, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
I've been looking through your website, Cinema Discourse, for a number of weeks now since we first talked on the phone and met, and you've got a wealth of information about the idea of movies as a cultural and mythological art form and relayer of messages to the mass public. Just tell us a little bit about what the purpose of the Cinema Discourse website is.
Well, the website was sort of co-designed with John Lebel, who's a professor of architecture out at Pratt, and he's an old friend of Joseph Campbell's, and he had known Joseph Campbell for a while and had done work with his posthumous writings at the Joseph Campbell Foundation. And I met him through doing work on Joseph Campbell's posthumous manuscripts. I wrote footnotes for them, and we met and we decided that we should put together a website companion to the book that I was working on, because I had just published the book, and he thought that it would make an ideal website. And the idea being that what we would explore would be specifically those kinds of films in which mythology featured as a really heavy, sort of obvious theme, and then address those issues from a sort of intellectual point of view. Because we found that we would go on the web and look for discussions of film in terms of the deeper meanings of what's going on in these movies. Everything from Hollywood movies to independent films. Our focus tends to be on Hollywood films just because they tend to have the kinds of budgets for rendering the kinds of special effects that are necessary to be true and authentic to the archaic mythos. They're visionary. They're non-realistic modes of communication. And that tends to require a lot of money. Not always. I mean, some directors, like David Cronenberg or Werner Herzog, are able to get away with small budgets and still render these things in mythic form. Right. But so we just wanted to find, we wanted to put together a website that would discuss this material, because we would find discussions on the net, or you read movie reviews in newspapers, and they tend to be very facile, surface-level discussions about whether the plot worked or didn't work, or who was good in this or that role. And we wanted to address more the archetypal language that going on in these films.
Why do movies affect us so deeply?
Yes, exactly.
People are transformed. I've talked often on this program how people are inspired by films, how their lives are changed by movies, their points of view, relationships in their lives, how they see the world, how they see themselves. I mean, there's so many aspects that come from film, and film being the dominant art form of the last 100 years, it really is no surprise that this is such a rich topic. So for the layperson out there, why is mythology in movies important to, like, the man on the street? What significance does it have for him?
Well, you could argue, and I do say this at certain points in the book, that film itself, no matter what you film and project on the screen, there's a spectacle aspect to cinema that almost automatically transforms anything that is projected onto the screen into a mythic spectacle. It's inherent to the medium, primarily because, number one, it's an imagistic medium, and myth, contrary to the French structuralists and pomo-theoreticians who tend to emphasize the linguistic aspects of myth. Myself, coming out of the Joseph Campbell tradition, who in turn interfaced with the German Romantic tradition, tends to focus on myth as an image language, and film as an image language, and the same goes for comic books too. That comic books are also inherently imagistic and visual, and you do tend to find myths cropping up there as well. So it's an image language, and almost anything you see, you go to see, will be communicating some kind of a myth. It may be in more subtle forms, like you may go see a realistic film like Schindler's List or something like that, and think that you're getting a dose of history and not realize that you are in fact getting a myth disguised as a linear narrative, as a realistic narrative. And so often, because myth is the grammar of the psyche, anytime you sort of tell a story, your mind unconsciously organizes the information in terms of mythic morphemes. I mean, there's a kind of grammar there that, there's a storytelling grammar, and it comes through in film in a very startling and vivid way. And I think that being aware of that also helps you be aware of why you respond emotionally to certain films the way you do, rather than just intellectually. Because the myth is a language that the psyche inherently understands automatically. Because you go to sleep and you dream every night. You're dreaming in this mythic language, and the body knows it. And it's part of the reason for why you react so emotionally to films, because it opens up all these little emotional floodgates. It bypasses the intellect. Then the intellect has to catch up later on and figure out, through reading or whatever, why you responded the way you did.
People go on these long investigations. I've seen people affected by a movie for weeks at a time. They're almost become obsessed with it. It really, as you said, it penetrates into the deep subconscious. And that's why I love discussions like this with you today. Is if people aren't aware of how powerful motion pictures are, and even now, of course, we have lots of stuff on the internet that people watch besides just movies on the big screen. To be ignorant of the ways that we are affected by movies and even television, people aren't really aware of that personally. It's something that they should be aware of. What are we being told on the daily news on television? And we really have to take a sort of a barometer of our own personal attitude and conscience at the moment that we're seeing something.
Exactly.
And I've mentioned that on the show. We have a show upcoming. I'm talking to Dr. Joe Dispenza about what's going on in the brain. He's a leading authority on that, is for when someone watches a movie. And I tend to think of it as when you're actually watching a film, you're actually in an altered state of consciousness.
Yes.
So movies are very dreamlike, so they evoke that state, and people have been hooked up to machinery where their brain waves are changing when they're watching a film. I think A Clockwork Orange is a fantastic example of how someone can be reprogrammed by images projected on a screen.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of my favorite films, too, because one of the leading themes in my book is about this interface between human beings and machines, and how machines and technology in general can dehumanize them. And that film is a classic example of, here's the premise. Let's take, this individual, Alex, who is very violent and cannot control his id and just sort of acts impulsively and spontaneously, and the impulses that he happens to follow are violent ones. And let's take him and put him through the sieve of the machine, rob him of his freedom by impressing upon him a kind of Skinnerian mode of classical conditioning that robs him of the freedom to make his own choices, and then see if we like the end result, that what comes out. And like Kubrick used to state in interviews, you don't like the result. Even though you know that his impulses were violent, you preferred him the way he was before, because something in us resists this idea of our impulses being bottled up and constrained artificially, especially through that kind of imposition of technology on human freedom. So that's one of the main themes I talk about in my book, is that conflict between the inner drive of humanity and what it is that technology does to us.
Let's go back a little bit in terms of film history. During the silent era, there was a lot of motion pictures that, of course, not having speaking in them, the aspect of the image itself and what people were seeing on screen was king. What they were responding to was just reading, which was very literary, because at that time the literary culture was the predominant information culture in America and the world. And then you have this idea of movies, and there's a lot of, especially in the fantasy and science fiction genre in the silent era. Has the language of mythology changed from the silent era to like the era of the 30s through each of the subsequent decades, and then we find where we're at today with technology? Do you see that there's some sort of a progression or adaptation by society